The air in Versailles was heavy with contradiction. It glittered and rotted in the same breath. From a distance, the palace shimmered like the very embodiment of heaven on earth, a golden jewel set against the French sky. Yet step closer, and the illusions began to crumble. Imagine it, the faint sweetness of perfume mingling with the acrid stench of human waste. The murmur of court musicians colliding with the sound of nobles slipping away to relieve themselves in stairwells or behind drapes. This was Versailles, the stage, where Louis XIV, the Sun King, attempted to perform the greatest drama of power in European history, and yet it was also the place where human dignity collapsed into filth. On May 6, 1682, Louis XIV officially moved his entire court to Versailles. In doing so, he created the most dazzling palace of its age, a residence that would awe visiting ambassadors and terrify rival kings. But with that decision, he also birthed one of the most unsanitary, degrading living experiments Europe had ever seen. Versailles was not just a palace, it was a pressure cooker. Tens of thousands of nobles, guards, servants, and officials were compressed into a space that had never been designed for such numbers. What unfolded inside its walls reveals not only the splendor of unchecked ambition, but also the grotesque consequences of neglecting the most basic human needs. Louis XIV's obsession with Versailles began much earlier. In 1661, construction commenced under architect Louis XIV and later Jules Hardouin-Mansart. The mission was as bold as it was audacious: to outshine every palace in Europe, to transform France into the cultural sun around which all other nations revolved. Versailles would be the theater of his glory, where every wall, every corridor, and every ceremonial ritual reinforced his absolute power. What had once been a modest hunting lodge, surrounded by marshland and forest, was to become the epicenter of civilization. And yet, in his fixation with spectacle, Louis XIV overlooked something fatally mundane. The question of how thousands of courtiers, aristocrats, and attendants would actually live there, how they would eat, wash, and relieve themselves, was brushed aside. Versailles was constructed for magnificence, not for function. No proper sewage system was built. No network of public latrines was considered. No infrastructure for sustaining the bodily needs of a small city was planned. It was as though the Sun King believed that grandeur itself could substitute for plumbing. When the court finally moved in 1682, Versailles instantly swelled with nearly 20,000 residents. The palace had never been meant to contain such a crowd. Corridors were overrun, kitchens strained, and above all, the lack of sanitation became catastrophic. With no facilities, nobles and servants resorted to desperate improvisation. They relieved themselves in corners, in stairwells, even in the grand ceremonial halls meant to impress visiting dignitaries. The breathtaking gardens of L'Entrée mired across Boyart, Europe for their precision and artistry doubled as sprawling latrines. Visitors strolling among manicured hedges often found themselves navigating more than just sculpted paths. This was the paradox of Versailles. The more it glittered on the outside, the more it rotted within, and everyone knew it. Behind closed doors, whispers circulated about the filth. Letters from courtiers mentioned the impossibility of keeping clothes clean or chambers free from odor. Nobles burned incense constantly in their rooms, but the air still clung with the sour tang of waste. Perfume became less a luxury than a necessity, a chemical veil to mask the unbearable truth. To understand just how extraordinary this was, we must remember the wider world of 17th century Europe. Cities like Amsterdam and even parts of London had already developed rudimentary waste systems. Medieval towns, centuries earlier, at least attempted to funnel sewage into moats or rivers. But Versailles, the supposed pinnacle of European civilization, had no such provision. In many ways, the poorest peasant in a rural village lived in cleaner conditions than the nobles of Versailles. The peasants might suffer hunger and hardship, but at least their homes did not reek with the accumulated waste of thousands. Louis XIV, in concentrating his court at Versailles, believed he was controlling the nobility. By forcing them to live under his watchful eye, dazzled by his rituals, he prevented them from scheming against him in their provincial strongholds. It was a masterstroke of political theatre, yet it also created a nightmare of overcrowding and degradation. The king had achieved absolute control, but at the cost of his courtiers' health, dignity, and sometimes even their lives. Even in its earliest years, Versailles was more than just a palace. It was a paradox written in stone and marble. It embodied the glory of monarchy and the squalor of human neglect. It stood as proof that unchecked power, when blind to practical needs, can create monuments not only to beauty, but to filth. The Sun King wanted immortality through architecture. What he built was indeed unforgettable, but for reasons he never intended. The first full winter of Versailles as the royal court 1683 exposed just how unsustainable the dream really was. The cold drove people indoors, forcing the stink to accumulate within the marble walls. Staircases grew slick with filth. Corridors became impossible to walk through without stepping into human waste. The noble salons, designed for glittering conversations and courtly intrigue, carried an odor that clung to the air like a curse. Even the most hardened courtiers, men and women trained to keep their faces impassive, sometimes faltered when the stench hit them. Versailles, a palace meant to awe, was instead suffocating its residents. The horror did not stop at the corridors. It seeped into every ritual, into the daily choreography of court life. Take the lever du Arrow, the king's rising ceremony. Each morning hundreds of nobles gathered to watch Louis XIV awaken and dress, a ritual intended to display his majesty and reinforce his central place in the universe. Yet behind the velvet curtains and the gilded mirrors, the atmosphere was anything but celestial. Dozens of unwashed bodies pressed into the room, mingling their sweat and odor with the ever-present stench from the halls. The spectacle, meant to glorify the Sun King, often resembled a suffocating ordeal for the senses. Madame de Maintenon, the king's secret second wife, recorded her despair in private letters. She confessed it was nearly impossible to maintain any semblance of cleanliness. Incense burned constantly in her chambers, but it was like throwing a silk scarf over a rotting corpse. Her clothes absorbed the palace's odors so thoroughly she had to change multiple times a day. Not for vanity, but for survival. Even jewels and gowns lost their glamour when steeped in the reek of human waste. The women of Versailles bore particular torment. Court fashion demanded gowns of unimaginable complexity, layers of silk, lace, and whalebone corsets that cinched the body until breathing itself was a labor. Using the bathroom in such clothing was a logistical nightmare. Some women avoided urinating for hours, even days, leading to chronic infections. Others simply surrendered, soiling themselves and relying on overwhelming perfumes to hide the evidence. Beneath the towering wigs and glittering gowns, their bodies bore humiliations invisible to the world. Versailles turned its women into statues of elegance, while subjecting them to the most degrading conditions imaginable. Men fared little better. Dignity at Versailles often meant endurance. During ceremonies and banquets, nobles slipped discreetly behind curtains or into corners to relieve themselves, sometimes in full view of others who had trained themselves not to react. The code of etiquette, once the backbone of aristocratic identity, bent itself into grotesque shapes just to accommodate the filth. A nobleman could soil himself during a ball, and the entire assembly would continue dancing as though nothing had happened. The silence of Versailles was not only about loyalty to the king, it was about survival in a palace where truth stank too much to acknowledge. Even food, the centerpiece of royal pageantry, was not spared from contamination. The kitchens were located far from the main halls, and food had to be carried along corridors that often doubled as open sewers. Trays passed through damp air heavy with waste, picking up invisible contaminants. It was no wonder that food poisoning was common. Banquets that dazzled guests with roasted pheasants and sugared confections often ended with nobles confined to their chambers, doubled over with sickness. The tragedy was that Versailles did not have to be this way. In Amsterdam, canals had long served as rudimentary sewage channels. Even in medieval Paris, cesspits and gutters provided some measure of sanitation. But Versailles, built at the height of Enlightenment, Europe ignored it all. The very palace that should have represented civilization at its peak collapsed into conditions more primitive than those of medieval villages. It was not ignorance that doomed Versailles, it was arrogance. To Louis XIV and his architects, sanitation was a trivial detail. Beneath the dignity of kings, beauty mattered more than plumbing, spectacle more than survival. For the courtiers, silence was the price of proximity to the king. They endured what peasants would have rebelled against, because to live at Versailles was to live in the center of power. To leave, to complain, was to risk banishment. Better to choke on filth and golden halls than to breathe freely in obscurity. Such was the logic of absolutism, carved not just into politics, but into the very lungs of those who lived under it. Everywhere one looked, Versailles embodied contradiction. The hall of mirrors dazzled with reflections of chandeliers, but the floors below were stained with urine. Nobles perfumed themselves with musk and ambergris, but the air was rank with excrement. Women appeared as icons of beauty, but their corsets hid infections and sores. Even the gardens, the pride of France, reeked of latrine pits disguised as ornamental groves. The palace was a jewel box filled with rot, a place where luxury and degradation existed in equal measure. This was Versailles not as the world remembers it today, but as it truly was, a palace of stench. And as the years went on, the consequences of that neglect would grow ever more deadly. By the late 1680s, the cost of ignoring sanitation at Versailles was no longer something that could be hidden behind curtains and perfume bottles. Disease began to stalk the gilded corridors. In 1689, a severe outbreak of dysentery swept through the palace, leaving dozens dead and hundreds gravely ill. The cause was obvious. Food contaminated as it passed through filthy passageways, drinking water fouled by human waste, and the constant exposure to air thick with infection. Versailles had become the breeding ground for epidemics, not only among servants but among nobles themselves, the very people whose lives were supposed to embody divine order. The irony was brutal. While peasants across France endured hunger and hardship, at least they often lived in cleaner environments than the aristocrats who claimed to embody civilization. At Versailles, filth was democratic in the worst sense. A duke and a stable boy might fall ill from the same poisoned air, yet to admit this publicly would have been unthinkable. Versailles was the theatre of absolutism, and no one dared disrupt the play. Instead of tackling the root problem, Louis XIV turned to masks. Literally, perfume, incense, and flowers were deployed in endless quantities. Courtiers burned ambergris, musk, and lavender, attempting to cover the reek of rot. The result was a suffocating blend of sweetness and stench, a sensory assault that foreign visitors often described with horror. Ambassadors reported that Versailles was habitable only for those with dead nostrils and iron stomachs. Such remarks circulated through diplomatic channels, quietly eroding France's image as the epicenter of refinement. Scandals soon followed. In 1687, during a lavish ball, a high-ranking noble lost control of his bowels in front of the assembled court. Musicians played on, dancers kept their steps, and not a single person reacted. The Code of Versailles demanded silence, even in the face of humiliation so public it might have destroyed a lesser man. To flinch, to laugh, to acknowledge what had happened, would have been to break the illusion, and illusions were the lifeblood of Versailles, but not every accident could be ignored. One of the most infamous moments came decades later, in 1755, when Madame de Pompadour, the powerful mistress of Louis XV, ascended the grand staircase during a reception. Before a delegation of foreign ambassadors, she stepped directly into a heap of human excrement. Her white silk shoes were ruined, and the shock was unforgettable. Diplomats carried the story back to their courts, and Versailles became the butt of whispered ridicule across Europe. The scandal forced the court to issue a bizarre new rule. No more light-colored shoes within the palace. Rather than address the sanitation crisis, etiquette adapted to conceal it. Versailles perfected denial into an art form. These humiliations were not merely personal, they were political. The court of Versailles was supposed to project French superiority. Every detail, from the king's morning ritual to the glittering banquets, was designed to impress visitors. But when ambassadors carried home tales of stench and filth, they undermined the very purpose of the palace. The Sun King's jewel had become a punchline in foreign capitals. Worse still, disease and degradation did not only strike bodies, they corroded dignity. Women who spent hours laced into gowns were forced to choose between infection and humiliation. Servants carried trays of food through sewage-soaked corridors, risking contamination at every step. Noblemen endured public accidents in silence. Versailles demanded endurance, not just of etiquette, but of biology. To live in the palace was to surrender basic human needs to the theatre of grandeur. And yet, remarkably, the illusion held. Nobles did not complain openly. They continued to flock to Versailles, desperate for the proximity to power. To be seen at court was worth soiling oneself in secret. Ambition, after all, has always been a stronger force than dignity. By the 18th century, Versailles was not only a palace of rot, but also a stage of shame. Every humiliation was absorbed into its rituals, every scandal cloaked by silence. To outsiders, this silence seemed incomprehensible. To insiders, it was survival. Versailles was less a home than a gilded cage, trapping its inhabitants in a performance they could not abandon. What no one could yet see was how these humiliations would one day become political dynamite. In the salons of Paris, philosophers and pamphleteers began whispering about the excesses of Versailles. The Golden Palace, they argued, was little more than a sewer in disguise. And as those whispers grew louder, the palace's most dangerous enemy was no longer disguise, it was perception. As the 18th century unfolded, Versailles swelled beyond imagination. By the 1770s, nearly 30,000 people lived, worked, and schemed within its walls, a population larger than many provincial towns. What had begun as a royal hunting lodge had metastasized into a city without the systems that made cities habitable. Every new wing brought more courtiers and servants, more gossip and ritual, more waste and never the infrastructure to manage it. Versailles became a paradox too grotesque to ignore. The greater its magnificence, the deeper its internal rot. Louis XV recognized the whispers but responded timidly. In 1728, private latrines were finally constructed, but only for the royal family. The rest of the palace's population remained condemned to filth. This half-solution created not relief but resentment, for it exposed the gulf between monarch and subject with visceral clarity. A sanitary hierarchy emerged, where kings and queens relieved themselves in relative comfort, while dukes, countesses, and guards improvised in corners. In a society obsessed with etiquette, waste became yet another tool of exclusion. Visitors noticed. Reports trickled through Europe, not just from ambassadors but from travelers who returned with stories of gilded chambers that smelled worse than stables. Versailles was still admired for its art and gardens, but its reputation as a living hell for those trapped inside spread steadily. To the English, it was proof of French vanity. To the Prussians, it was evidence of aristocratic weakness. To the people of Paris, who starved for bread, it was an insult beyond endurance. One incident in 1755 symbolized the absurdity of Versailles in its purest form. Madame de Pompadour, Louis XV's brilliant and powerful mistress, stepped into human excrement on the palace staircase during a formal reception. Ambassadors watched, horrified. Her pristine shoes were ruined, and the embarrassment lingered long after the stain was scrubbed away. But instead of fixing the underlying problem, the court adjusted etiquette. Light-colored shoes were banned. The logic was chilling in its simplicity. If filth could not be removed, then it must be concealed. Versailles, always obsessed with appearances, chose illusion over reality. By the reign of Louis XVI, the situation had grown untenable. The palace was bursting with courtiers, guards, priests, musicians, cooks, and countless servants. The strain of maintaining dignity in such conditions became unbearable. Revolutionary pamphlets circulating in Paris began to weaponize the palace's squalor, describing Versailles as a golden sewer where nobles wallowed in their own waste, while France's poor went hungry. Writers mocked the idea of elegance born from filth, transforming the palace's sanitation crisis into a political metaphor. Marie Antoinette, the queen so often accused of frivolity, recognized the problem in her own way. In the 1780s, she commissioned private bathrooms in her wing and attempted to enforce stricter rules of personal cleanliness. To her, these were gestures of modernity, attempts to soften the humiliations that women especially endured. But to the people of France, who endured famine and poverty, her gilded tubs and perfumed chambers appeared as proof of her detachment from reality. The contrast was obscene: peasants without bread, and a queen bathing in luxury. Versailles had thus become something far greater and far more dangerous than a palace. It was a symbol, and not the one Louis XIV had envisioned. For decades, it had been meant to embody the strength, culture, and refinement of France. Now it embodied corruption, arrogance, and decay. Its very stench became political dynamite. When pamphleteers described nobles perfumed in jewels while literally living among excrement, they were not just reporting scandal, they were fanning revolutionary fire. By the late 1780s, France was a tinderbox, and Versailles was the matchbox everyone pointed to. The palace that once dazzled Europe had become shorthand for everything wrong with monarchy itself. Its golden facade no longer inspired aught, provoked rage. And when the revolution finally came in 1789, Versailles was not simply a residence under siege. It was a symbol already condemned in the minds of the people, a gilded coffin for a dying regime. When the revolution erupted in 1789, Versailles was one of its first and most symbolic targets. To the revolutionaries storming its golden gates, the palace was not simply a residence of kings, but a monument to everything rotten in the old order. They entered expecting mirrors, chandeliers, and opulence, and found them. But they also discovered something far more shocking: the physical evidence of decades of neglect. Accounts describe an odor that clung to every wall, curtains and carpets soaked in waste, staircases that reeked of centuries of filth. Versailles was not just a political symbol of corruption, it was a literal health hazard. When the royal family fled, workers were assigned the monumental task of cleansing the palace. What they uncovered was staggering: piles of human waste hidden in corners, stuffed behind panels, and caked into stairwells. Fabrics, tapestries, and draperies ruined beyond repair. Wooden floors so thoroughly soaked in urine that they had to be ripped out. Marble impregnated with odors that could not be scrubbed away. The cleanup took months, and still the stench lingered. Versailles, once conceived as a dream of civilization, was revealed to have been little more than a gilded latrine. This was Versailles' final humiliation, but also its transformation. The monarchy that had built it was gone, toppled by revolution, but the palace itself remained. In the centuries that followed, it was reimagined. By the 19th century, Versailles no longer served as a royal residence. Instead, it was repurposed as a museum, restored and sanitized. Walls were polished, mirrors shined, gardens replanted. The filth was scrubbed from memory, leaving behind a version of Versailles that dazzled without offending. Today, millions of tourists wander its halls in awe, unaware that the pristine marble beneath their feet once absorbed centuries of excrement. Yet history refuses to be erased. Diaries, letters, and diplomatic reports preserve the reality that Versailles' modern incarnation conceals. They remind us that Versailles was not just a monument of beauty, but a theater of human suffering, especially for women trapped in impossible fashions, for servants forced to carry food through sewage-soaked corridors, for nobles who endured public humiliations in silence. Versailles teaches us that luxury without dignity is not luxury at all, it is oppression wrapped in gold leaf. Historians now view Versailles as a failed social experiment. It concentrated thousands of people under one roof, without planning for their survival. Even medieval towns had rudimentary sewage systems. Versailles, the crown jewel of Enlightenment France, had none. This contradiction became a metaphor more powerful than any pamphlet. The monarchy could build golden halls, but could not provide toilets. The inability to manage waste symbolized its inability to govern a nation in crisis. The palace that was meant to embody immortality instead became a warning. Its beauty endures, but so does its lesson. Power obsessed with appearances will always neglect reality. Grandeur without responsibility collapses into grotesque decay. Versailles is proof that unchecked ambition can rot even the grandest dreams into nightmares. Today, as tourists admire the Hall of Mirrors, few imagine the stench that once clung to its floors. As they stroll through gardens, they do not picture nobles relieving themselves behind hedges. The Versailles they see is sanitized, curated, and magnificent. But the Versailles of history was something else entirely, a place where civilization, as finest clothes, could not disguise the smell of its neglect. And that duality, glory and filth, wonder and warnings, why Versailles still matters. It was built to immortalize power, but instead it immortalized decay. It is a permanent reminder that no crown, however golden, can protect a ruler who ignores the dignity of his people. The Sun King sought to build eternity in stone. What he left behind was eternal, but not in the way he intended. Versailles will forever stand as both a wonder and a warning.